as Harnoot comes in behind, hits a long shot right out towards the centre of the game, met by Bob Ashton, who hits it clear of the gain again, and that is the finish of the game with Australia, the Goulburn team of Australia winning against the Jaguars of England by 9 goals to 7.
On the Sydney ground, two world-famous teams prepare for battle. In the light jerseys, Scone opposing them Goulburn, a team of 4 brothers.
The English didn't know what to expect, but they didn't expect them to be the success they were.
Wayne, or his name, Ashton.
But, I mean, you look back at it at this stage and you think, God almighty, you know, what a gamble.
Nick Jugger sees Goulburn playing the other way, but with the same perfect teamwork. That right wooden ball goes from brother to brother as their ponies go through in decking style. And it's another goal.
I mean, they really were flying blind. They did not have a great idea of how they would stack up.
Ashton to Ashton, dust to dust. If one doesn't score, the other one must. Their crowd leaders beat Ashton.
Going out into the unknown, you know, and they weren't super wealthy or anything like that. And, you know, for a family, they weren't real risk takers, but this was quite a big risk.
Ponies and riders carry off. So to another Ashton charge as they go for their 7th goal and victory. Ah, here comes somebody. Player's name, Ashton.
Australia, 1930. In a country of less than 7 million people, still establishing its nationhood, Australia barely registered on the world scene. Sydney had no harbour bridge. Don Bradman was not yet a household name. If the British thought of Australia much at all, it was largely as a faraway, rugged colony of empire, a source of food and fibre. All that was about to change. In the unlikely setting of Markdale, a sheep property in the isolated rolling hills of southwestern New South Wales, a story with the makings of a legend was stirring.
It was a very adventurous thing to do, and obviously the press followed polo as a sport more than they do today, and I think it caught people's fancy, and so people just seemed to know about the famous Ashton polo team.
Everyone related to horses, and most people related to horse sports. Now polo is, in some way, it's a little anachronistic because we don't ride horses all the time. In fact, less and less do people ride horses.
4 brothers, Jim, Bob, Jeff and Phil Ashton, hatched an impetuous plan to take on the English and American polo worlds, then in their golden ages and at the height of their glamour. Their father, James Ashton, pioneer and self-made man, and their mother, Helen, an artistic Anglican minister's daughter, joined their enterprise. It became a make-or-break family affair. The Ashtons and Australia take on the world.
Brave, if not totally foolhardy, when one thinks back on it. And you've read about the trip over there and the risks that they ran with losing the horses, and it was an extraordinary thing to do.
They opened a lot of people's eyes in England as to Australia. The focus that they put into achieving what they did just boggles the mind to me.
People playing polo today applied themselves like the Ashtons. Everyone will be watching polo.
And yet, at every crucial point, it almost went disastrously wrong. The Ashton brothers were born at the time of Australian Federation.
When Helen Ashton gave birth to her 4th son, the doctor famously said, "Mrs. Ashton, you've now got a polo team."
The boys were raised in Sydney, but in 1920, James Ashton bought Markdale, a property 90 kilometres southwest of Goulburn. The idea was that each of his sons could go there as they progressively left their Sydney schools and learn to run the property as a family enterprise. The dream was that one day each son would have his own property.
It was a sheep grazing property. Their job was to run 8,000 sheep.
They worked very hard. There were a lot of rabbits there, and then they had all their sheep to look after.
No, it was quite remote. I mean, I always wondered a bit why the grandfather picked on Markdale. I think it was so run down, had so many rabbits, the fences were all falling down, and he thought, well, he'll keep these boys out of trouble and pack them off to Markdale. So none of them ever went to university. It's interesting that later on they went on and did some of the things they did.
Polo is like hockey on horseback. The rules are the same. You hit the ball with a stick. The only the big difference, obviously, is you're mounted. And that is what makes polo the most elegant of the games.
Polo is played by a team of 4 horsemen over about an hour or so, divided into several chukkers or periods. The winning team is the one who hits the most goals. Victory depends not only on the skill of the player, but also on the skill, build and stamina of the horse. While no longer a premier sport, back then polo commanded a large following in the stands and in the press.
Polo took off in the mid-1920s because the aristocracy in England played the game. In the United States, it was very popular. Actually, some polo games at Meadowbrook had more spectators than college American football. And in England, Hurlingham was really the epicenter of the world as far as polo is concerned.
In 1930, no Australian team had ever competed with their own horses in England or the USA.
The family myth was that the grandfather didn't want them to play polo. He thought that was a dilettante, rich sport. And the grandmother wanted them to play because, play together, stay together.
At the beginning, he was really sceptical about it. He felt that his boys should not be sort of whiling their time away in such a expensive and elite sport. But he liked the fact that the horses were used in stock work. He thought, well, they're still working horses, so I guess we can live with that. And it's fun. If you've got children that are doing quite well at sport, it's quite fun watching them. Yeah, you go for the ride.
Well, there was a Colonel McCartney at Goulburn who, after the First World War, thought artillery was the answer, and he wanted to get all these young graziers interested in becoming artillery officers. So polo was introduced as an incentive. Come and play polo and I'll brainwash you. And the brainwashing was totally unsuccessful, but they went on from there.
And it took them quite a few years to get going. But I think they were all fairly good athletes and good ball players. And, they were 4 brothers that always played together.
The brothers quickly became infatuated with polo, training themselves and their horses at every opportunity.
They basically loved the game as soon as they started playing it. It's very, very seductive.
They were completely committed and very passionate about it. And they'd started from nothing. I mean, they bought cheap ponies and made them into good polo ponies, and they played and they practiced and they really lived and breathed polo. And there was one story where someone said, they think and talk nothing else except for polo. All the books in their bookshelves are about polo or horsemanship. There's only one book there which wasn't, and that was the Travels of Marco Polo, and they bought that one by mistake.
In a time before accessible air travel or sealed roads, getting polo horses to regular matches in Goulburn was often more challenging than the games themselves.
I mean, it's incredible to think about it. The boys used to walk the horses into Goulburn, which is about 80 kilometres. They'd start them walking on Friday, play them on the weekend, walk them back on Monday. You know, a couple of them might be in the shearing shed, two of them would be riding 2 horses and driving another 15 or so. Off they'd go to Goulburn.
The great way to make horses is long hours in the saddle. A wet saddle cloth, I think I've heard that 100 times. They got their horses there, but at the same time, they were getting their horses really fit and they were getting their legs really strong so as they could take the bumps, etc., etc., etc. My father and his brothers, their personalities were, to a very large extent, set by where they came in the family.
There's no doubt Walt's father, Jim, was the undisputed boss. Probably helped that he was a very good amateur boxer.
My father was the oldest. He was very strict, very hard-working, very a fair man, but expected to be given respect and obeyed.
And I remember him as a kid, he used to, during the war, so he used to come around the properties, check the properties out, beat the kids and depart. We regarded him with terror and awe. So I think his younger brothers probably did somewhat too.
Dad would have been called today a horse whisperer, I think. Dad was noted for getting on horses that some people wouldn't get in the same yard with. They'd just go for him. Dad was the one who used to stop by drovers and driving along, see a drover and check out his horses and see if they would come home with random horses. Dad was legendary for his shocking temper.
The other brothers always said he was very relaxed, and they used to have to wind him up before a game, and Bob they used to have to hose down because he got very intense before a game. And I think my father was like that. He was pretty laid back. But he was a very good athlete. He was a very good ball player. He was a good cricketer, a good tennis player.
He was perhaps the most gifted polo player in the team, but he never had the best horses. It was almost as though the other brothers had sort of shoved him off, or my dad and Uncle Bob had shoved him off and they got the best horses, and their Uncle Jeff got the third best horses.
Dad was a very nice man, very physically tough and quite courageous. I'd say he was quite shy and reserved. Dad used to say being in the team was a bit like being a member of the Communist Party because, for instance, you might have a really good horse that you'd trained to do really well, but it could be taken off you and given to somebody else in the team. Jim would say, maybe that horse of yours, Phil, I think so-and-so should ride it. So I always thought that was quite amusing.
They were extremely close. They really hung tight. And a lot of the reason they did so well was that they did hang tight.
The brothers first competed together in 1926. They quickly dominated local teams and set their eyes on the biggest polo prize in Australia, the Dudley Cup. However, one team stood in their way.
The big team to beat was Harden, Ross brothers.
Harden were the kings, and they played Harden 19 times without beating them.
Their next opportunity against Harden would be at the 1929 Dudley Cup. Victory would make them the top club team in Australia. But halfway across the world, the stakes of this colonial tournament were about to get even higher.
Grandfather Ashton was well connected and had been in New York on state business. And it was through this, talking to people such as Roosevelt, that the invitation was issued to the 4 boys to come and play polo in Long Island. They got the invitation, and instead of just doing it, they took that invitation to the Australian Polo Association and asked for endorsement. And as soon as they said, we've been invited to go and play at Long Island, everyone wanted a bit of the action. And it just became very political.
If there was an Australian team going to go, the Polo Association was going to pick the team, and there was going to be a lot of politics on that. But these 4 brothers wanted to go, and they were picking themselves, so they weren't going to let themselves be called an Australian team.
The Ashtons did a deal with the APC. If we can win the 1929 Dudley Cup, then we represent Australia in America.
The game of their lives beckoned. At the final of the Dudley Cup, Harden once again opposed them. A huge crowd gathered from across New South Wales, but the game did not go as expected.
It was going to be a serious game, but Irwin Maple-Brown, who also comes from Goulburn and was an 8-goal player and perceived as the best polo player in Australia, got knocked out in the second chukker. And they scrambled him back on his horse because they were really tough in those. Well, they didn't bother about anything, you know, if you could. But he was so badly knocked out, he was going in the wrong direction. And so they had to take him off the field and replace him with someone who was just a shadow of himself.
Although in controversial circumstances, the Ashtons defeated Harden to win the Dudley Cup and a ticket to America, or so they thought.
Eventually they beat them, but once they beat them, Harden never ever beat them again. After they won, there was a selection, and 6 players were selected to go, and 2 people who were not going were Dad and Uncle Phil. And the boys said, "And you honour your deal, or we're out."
There was incredible jealousy against them, or they perceived it to be. And I think, you know, from what I pick up, there was, you know, how dare they go? We could have gone there and done as well, but we couldn't get off their asses and stop arguing amongst one another to actually do it.
Anyway, by this time, the Americans had heard of all the backbiting and they just said, forget the trip. And the trip was off and they'd blown the lot. I mean, they had this, if you like, carrot put in front of them by the Americans, and they were thinking, you know, they were all thinking, oh, gee, this will be really great. We're off to America and it's all paid for and we're going to have a lot of fun. And then all of a sudden, politics and a whole lot of things blow it away. And you can imagine people in their mid to early 20s extremely disappointed. I mean, it's... Even today, it would be the adventure of a lifetime. Then it was just something else.
Even though they had finally beaten Harden and won the Dudley Cup, they returned to Markdale feeling defeated.
After this, it was my Uncle Phil, who was the youngest. They were mustering sheep, so the story goes, and he said, why don't we go to England? And they gave it some thought, and they said, OK, let's see what we can do. And they decided to go to England on a self-funded trip. And they planned it meticulously.
Look, I mean, you know, nothing Australians would rather do than go and take the Brits on their own turf and beat them at something. I mean, and this one was a bit more exotic than some, I suppose, but, you know, I mean, that's nothing better than doing that.
The Ashtons contacted the Hurlingham Club in England, who invited Goulburn to compete in the 1930 English season.
You must remember at this time, it was very rare to have international polo. The polo that was being played in London would have been English teams playing against English teams. There might have been a few Indian teams coming over, but it was largely a domestic affair.
No Australian team had ever competed overseas with their own horses, for good reason.
Because the costs were enormous.
No one else had ever done it, so they had to work out, OK, we've got to get our horses fit.
I mean, one of the things that drove them to England was that it was getting pretty tough here at the time. The wool prices were right down. They put together this good string of ponies and they reckon they could sell them for, you know, maybe a total of what would have been £6,000 then. And they thought they could sell them in England for, you know, an order of magnitude more than that.
Their way of getting their money back was by selling their polo ponies. Well, gee, go along and see your bank manager today and say, and I'm going to sell my polo ponies when I get to England. And he's going to say, well, that's good. Got any guarantees? I think the only way they got the money to go there was because Grandfather Ashton guaranteed them.
I'm always amazed that the old grandfather let him do it. So there's been a lot of thought put into it. And I think they were just off on a grand adventure.
With Markdale on the line, failure was not an option. Getting themselves over to England was the easy part. Getting the horses over, however, was a challenge no one had ever dared to take on.
There'd never been horses that had been shipped so far in one go.
The normal situation was if you sent horses overseas, you put them in a little narrow stall. The horse just stood there. If it went to England, you couldn't do anything with it for 6 months.
But Dad and his brothers thought, well, what's the difference from exercising horses at sea as opposed to exercising them on land?
They looked at ships and they thought, oh, the port line have these ships that if we do this, this and this and this, we can get loose boxes along the side and put a sand yard up the front and we can exercise them. And the detail they went into, they weren't doing it to come second.
And they designed the whole trip, the horse boxes, the ship, the exercise yard on the ship, quite a small ship, and planned the whole thing so that they were able to actually play polo on these ponies less than 4 weeks after they got there. Oh, nobody had ever done it. It was totally new from that point of view. It's not like these days where you shove them on an aeroplane, you're there 24 hours later.
Bringing the horses with them was critical to their success. The brothers had spent years putting together their now well-trained horses and building a strong bond with them.
A very good polo player can overcome the horse, but basically the horse is what puts you where the ball is. The horse is what enables you to enter the contest.
You've got to get to know the horse and the horse has to get to know you, and that way you'll be able to achieve things.
But they just babied these horses, I suspect, and it made them different.
Of all the 25 horses the Ashtons intended to bring, their pride and joy was a dapple cream part Arab mare called Checkers.
Checkers they bought when they were looking for horses, and immediately you realised that this horse was very, very clever.
Bob Ashton wrote of Checkers, she was the most aggressive temperament, and if turned out with other horses, would fight all of them until she bossed the paddock full. She was the most intelligent pony I've ever seen, and probably one of the best lightweight ponies of all time.
2 weeks before they were to go, they told the world. And if the polo community absolutely blew up, we are going to go as a private team, but we would like the endorsement of the Australian Polo Council.
The Australian Polo Association held a meeting and then a vote, and begrudgingly gave their endorsement. The Ashtons were to play as the Goulburn Polo team.
They were virtually unforgiven for some time.
The Goulburn Polo team departed Sydney Harbour for their 7-week journey. The brothers were determined to keep their horses fit and occupied in that time.
They had the exercise yard built on the ship and they rode the horses in that yard.
They had one person leading and then one person behind. Some of the horses were a little bit nervous.
Every day, day in, day out, 24 horses.
Galloping around a circle as big as this room, because that's all they'd have, but to keep the horses fit.
So the horse would almost be have its hind legs almost in the centre of the yard and be cantering around its hind legs, which is actually very good for a polo pony because it's all about getting them back on their hind legs. If they're not taking the weight and the strain on their hind legs, they'll break down in the front legs.
The captain was and knew that they were going to pass another ship coming the opposite direction. He knew the captain of that opposing ship, and it was a liner. It was his great joy to have two of the boys riding their horses round in a circle in the sand yard and the peak while the other crew, what are we watching here? The captain couldn't miss the opportunity to have this boast to his friend who had an upmarket passenger liner, but he didn't have polo ponies.
The brothers had been blessed with mostly good weather, but when they emerged from the Suez Canal into the Mediterranean, a huge storm welled up.
I mean, they could have been shipwrecked. I mean, it was a serious storm they ran into. The water was coming over the decks, and then one of the horses nearly got washed off the boat. They managed to pull it back on. I think the horses, and I've seen this in trucking situations, suddenly the horses realised they've got to trust us. One of the horses that was so nervous, when it was under real pressure, it just followed my father to its box. Yet previously it had never done it, but it anticipated, I've got to trust this man because we got a problem.
It was a massive storm, and Phil heard the wave coming.
Phil, they didn't know that he suddenly got hit by a wave that came over. And they fortunately, Phil had got a rope and tied himself to the rope. So while he got washed off the boat, he was able to pull himself back on.
But they thought he'd gone overboard till he said, rather wet, bedraggled-looking Phil appeared round the corner.
It was very dangerous. They could have lost then and there half their horses, and perhaps one of them. It was quite dramatic.
The storm weathered. Their ship limped into England.
Arriving in England as 4 young brothers by one father out of one mother, I mean, amazing, were the horses.
You had 4 boys from the Antipodes. They were well educated. They were in a lean Australian way. They were good looking. They were what people expected Australians to be. Slim, lean, laconic, understated.
There were a number of major tournaments played in what was called the London season in May, June and July, and the Ashton Brothers, when they came over, played that London season.
It's exciting when there's a new team in town. People get sick of playing one another. They like someone to come in and add a little bit of excitement and drama to the whole thing. They had just got off the boat and they were having a practice match.
International opinion of Australian polo in the 1920s was not very high.
The British said, well, you know, here are these Australians. We hope that they don't embarrass themselves too much.
The English, you know, just have a hit around, boys, and, you know, we'll have this, you know, just school a few horses and what have you. And suddenly they came out and went for it, caught the brothers by surprise.
They weren't really pushing the horses and they were getting touched up a little bit. And as they went off the ground, my Uncle Bob, who was probably the most fiery of the Ashtons, heard them say, well, you know, as soon as we start moving along, these guys, we're finding they're not so flash. And so they went back to the trucks and my Uncle Bob said, get your best horse. And so they went out in the next chukker and instead of playing off the bit, they went for it. And of course, Apps, they weren't expecting it. And no doubt started taking them really hard. And of course, hit lots of goals and wiped the smiles off their faces. We're here for the outcome. We just want to win. It doesn't matter whether you think we're good. We just want to win. It's about competition.
With no international standard of comparison at the time, the brothers had no idea how they would stack up against quality opposition. From now on, they knew they could hold their own.
Hey, we're going to be competitive.
The Ashtons had made their mark, and the press followed their progress with great interest as they began their polo season.
The play of the Ashton Brothers in 1930 in England was a revelation.
The English polo was quite an old-fashioned way of playing, whereas the Australian style, which was more similar to the American style, would have involved longer hitting, probably faster horses, and a faster style of play than would have been typical in Britain at that time.
While their opponents had taken note of the Ashtons, the wider English polo community really began to pay attention when they defeated the Hurricanes, a team widely considered the best private team in the world. This victory helped them to win the Whitney Cup, the main handicapped event of the season.
Well, beating the Hurricanes was huge. They were the best team in England that summer, or everyone thought they were. They had Gerald, who was considered the best in the world at some stage, and the Ashton Brothers had beaten them on handicap.
There was a huge social scene based around polo in England. Royalty, big business owners, the elite of society all moved within these lavish parties and gatherings. As the story of the Ashton Brothers gained momentum, they received regular invites to these gatherings.
Oh, I think they were. I think they were really fated. I mean, they must have had an absolutely whale of a time, I think.
Everyone wants to rub their shoulder with fame, and at this particular stage, they were famous.
Well, Dad tells the story about them being invited to a hunt ball, and they just had their first day's practice, and he was quite stiff, and he trod on this girl's toe, and he said, "I'm very sorry, I'm a little stiff from polo." And she said, "I don't care where you're from." You know, maybe the good polo players got the girls.
Probably the English had no idea that they probably had almost their last penny in the venture. Probably thought they were wealthy squatters from Australia.
The radio guy was talking, and he said, you know, not only can these Australians play polo, but there's this young man called Bradman, and he's very good at cricket as well.
You know, they were good looking, dashing young country boys.
My dad, who was certainly the most serious of the four of them, he, in fact, curtailed their social activities because he thought it was interfering with their polo.
Their focus paid off. The Ashtons won the Ranelagh Handicap Cup and the Indian Empire Shield. Of the 21 matches the Ashtons played in England, they won 16. But it was all a lead-up to the biggest event in the English polo.
The top club was the Hurlingham Cup. That was the holy grail for club teams.
The Hurlingham Challenge Cup was the most important cup in London polo in the 1930s, and it was the trophy that everybody wanted to win.
And Hurlingham was just on the outskirts of London. Of course, it is a country club now, and a lovely country club. That was the game to win.
For the major matches played at Hurlingham Club, there would have been crowds of about 10,000–15,000 people. A lot of the people were ordinary members of the public that were fascinated by the game and the attractions of the game, but they were also attended by the royal family and some very wealthy families in this country. Certainly the British royal family took a keen interest and were regular visitors to the Hurlingham Club, both as spectators and as players, but also, for instance, the King of Spain, who played polo at the Hurlingham Club, watched the Goulburn team on a number of occasions, and we've got photographs of the King of Spain watching Australia playing England.
The Ashtons had invested heavily in their trip. So much depended on the successful sale of their ponies and finding the right buyer. Success at the Hurlingham Cup, the biggest event of the season, was crucial. With Markdale on the line, the brothers had a lot more to play for than just victory. Although pitted against very strong opposition, their opening round victories booked them a place in the final against the Hurricanes, the best private team in England. While the Ashtons had beaten them in the previous outing on handicap, the Hurlingham Challenge Cup would give them no benefit this time.
When they rode out for the final, they thought, we have succeeded. They just did not want to get beaten badly.
And now Australia's again on the attack.
The Hurricanes took an early lead in the match, leading Goulburn 6-2. Jim Ashton decided it was time to give checkers a run.
There was a very famous English player called Gerald, and Dad was on checkers. and he was very good at dribbling the ball. It's quite hard to do.
Takes the ball out to the sideline, followed by Jim Ashton and Gerald Balding.
And he ran the length of the Hurlingham ground, dribbling the ball, and Gerald Balding was behind him. And I think Gerald Balding might have been 8 or 9 or 10 goals. Like, he was seriously good. He was trying to hook him.
Jim Ashton took the ball from Balding, coming down the sideline, gets bumped.
But Chicks was too fast.
And he gets the ball near the boards, hits it across in front of Jeff Ashton. But Jeff Ashton gets onto this, hits a hard backhander down the field. Gerald Balding tries to meet it, doesn't quite get onto it. And now Australia's again on the attack. Jeff Ashton, Jim Ashton here, hits this ball up a tremendous shot.
With only one chukker to go, Goulburn had drawn level with the Hurricanes at 6 goals apiece.
Bob Ashton riding up. Sanford here, hit that ball right down the centre of the field. It goes right out to Bob Ashton, who bumps Balding over the top of it. And hits the ball past Jim Ashton. Jeff Ashton here now does a very good back shot right up to Jim Ashton, who straightens his pony and gets a go.
The match went right down to the wire, but this was the last goal the Ashtons would score that day. The Hurricanes would win the final 9-7.
I don't know what the English players would have thought about the Ashton brothers before they got here, but I know they will have been hugely impressed by them by the time they left.
Well, they got beaten by 2 goals, and that was the four brothers playing together. But I think that was extraordinary. I'm sure as far as the British were concerned, it was the absolutely ideal result. They'd done terribly well if we did beat them when it was really serious.
The match was considered to be one of the most thrilling ever played at Hurlingham, garnering praise in the press, in the stands, and at the very top of polo society.
And I think the King of Spain, the then King of Spain, was present at the match, and the family story was that he presented a special cup to them.
Because he had been so impressed by their play in the Hurlingham Challenge Cup. The Polo Monthly described the Ashton brothers' visit as they came, they saw, they conquered.
The thing about the story is it just has these ebbs and the flows. They finish this fantastic trip to England. They get to the final of the Champion Cup. They acquit themselves extremely well. The King of Spain is so impressed that he gives my grandfather a cup, and they're absolutely on a high. And then they think we better cash the horses in. And you know what happened in 1930, don't you? The stock market crash. And they're stuffed.
Unfortunately, the price of polo ponies tanked, and they were selling for meat per pound.
Absolutely changed the market. There was no buying.
And it was pretty horrific. And it wasn't going to get better in a hurry.
The Ashtons were looking at financial disaster.
This was how they were going to pay the money back. And the market's just trashed. The story had been heard of in America. And this American contacted them and said, look, if you can get yourselves here, then I will assure you that through the sale of your horses, you will cover your expenses plus more.
They were worried about the horses because they'd played such a long season in England. Then they had to ship them to America, and they had to arrange for them to be sold. And no one really knew what the market was going to be like because the recession or the depression was looming.
Playing against it was facing bankruptcy. They were damned if they did and they damned if they don't, so they had to go.
Only weeks after their final game at Hurlingham, the Ashtons and their 25 ponies travelled by sea to New York City. They planned to play several exhibition games before putting their ponies to a very challenging market.
No, it was a huge gamble taking them to the States.
They owned Markdale. They owned Markdale free title. So they actually took out a further mortgage on Markdale, went and they played in America. As I think Dad says in the story, they were playing against bankruptcy.
But even getting into the country proved challenging.
It was prohibition, of course, in the States at that time. The story was that they had to put them through customs and pay a tariff on them at the time.
That would have just sent them broke.
A customs officer came on board, said he wanted to go down the cab.
And they had, being good little Australian boys, they got rid of all their whiskey.
As soon as he got down the cab, he said, "Have you got any of the good stuff?" And they'd thrown all the drink out the porthole before they got into harbour because they were worried about prohibition.
But things were about to get even worse.
Customs person was meeting Dad and his brothers on the boat, and a journalist walked by and he saw a truck. And on the truck was, "We will be selling the Argentine and Australian polo ponies at a sale such and such and such and such and such." This guy, they'd never spoken to them.
And then what they were concerned about was if they knew there was a sale coming up, the customers would value them on the basis of what the sale prices were. Somebody came up and told Bob that the trucks had arrived to take the horses and blazoned down the side of them with these great banners saying, "Sale of Australian polo ponies." So Bob went down and tore the signs off the trucks and they kept the customs guy in the cabin.
And then, of course, the journalist said, "I've just seen a big advertisement for these horses to be sold in America." And Dad and his brothers said, no, we haven't spoken to anyone. Anyway, the customs officer to the journalist, "Well, come and show me where this advertisement for the Ashton horses is." And so he took them to the truck and he said, "There it is." And it was gone. And he said, "I'm sure I saw that." And Uncle Bob said, "Look, it's Argentina and Australia. It's very easy to make that sort of mistake. Very easy."
So the customs guy was pretty confused and in the end they settled on the figure.
The Ashtons played several exhibition games on Long Island against some of the top club teams in America.
They did very well in America. They couldn't beat the best American team. And also their horses, they'd lost a little bit of their edge and they thought they'd lost a little bit of their edge.
Although not at their best, the Ashtons won 5 of the 7 games they played in America. On the social scene, they again proved a sensation.
The Americans were very much waiting for them.
They were thrown into this world of wealthy and famous people, which was quite an eye-opener, I suppose.
There was one fellow there that they played polo against called Tommy Hitchcock. They used to call him 10-Gold Tommy, and it is said that The Great Gatsby was modelled on Tommy Hitchcock. My Uncle Bob, moving in these circles and being quite a man with the ladies, squired around Betty Davis for a certain amount of time, which we're all very proud of.
At one stage they were at a dance and my father went to dance with this attractive girl, and when he came back to the table the other brothers said, "What did you talk to her about when you were dancing?" And he said, "Oh, well, nothing much, but I told her she was a very good dancer." And he'd been dancing with Adele Astaire, who was the sister of Fred Astaire.
Their social excursions were a glimpse at the final days of heady excess in America. The Depression would soon bring this world to its knees, as well as their opportunity of recovering their costs.
The sale was all important. I mean, that's what really mattered, because their property was on the line and perhaps Chihuahua was on the line too.
The day before the sale, there was a wealthy polo player called Laddie Sanford, who was very much a prospective buyer. And he, I think, had an accident or he was ill and he was confined to bed. And so Phil's duty the next morning was to go round to the Sanford house and knock on the door and inquired as to Mr. Sanford's health. And the butler who opened the door said solemnly, bowing to him, "Mr. Sanford will be at the sale this afternoon." "Sir?"
The next day, the auction began in front of 800 people at Long Island. The sale exceeded all expectations.
For the times, they were top prices for top ponies.
I think they almost wanted to pay top dollar for the Australian horses because they just thought this was such a romantic, dramatic, exciting thing to do. And, well, shit, we've got so much money, what does it matter?
You know, they covered all their losses, all their mortgages, and then sterling devalued, and suddenly they were seriously in the money.
So the Ashtons had still did very, very well, well out of it. So in that sense, I think the gambling spirit had probably run out.
I mean, I would not be surprised if some people in American polo could trace some of their horses back to the horses that they bought from the Ashtons.
The sale price of $77,600 was back then a small fortune, equivalent to nearly $5 million today. With their costs more than covered and Markdale saved, they made their final journey back to Australia.
And basically they came back and, well, they just each had a very, very valuable, significant property as a result of... I've never known people who made so much money out of polo, actually.
James Ashton had realised his dream of each of his sons owning their own property.
Everyone loves a winner. And at the end of the day, they might have been rubbish from the south, but they were Australians, and they did win. And that brings a reflection upon Australian polo and Australian sportsmen and the emergence of a new colony.
Their analytical ability to analyse the game is unsurpassed. To be close to the Ashtons, it is one of the great moments and opportunities of my life.
The Ashtons were a milestone in the history of the game. Simple as that. They took an unknown team from Australia, on the other side of the world, to England at the time. Perhaps the most powerful nation in the world of polo, and they showed their mettle. What they did is really heroic.
The final of the Champion Cup at Hurlingham 1937 between Goulburn, Australia versus the Jaguars. Miss hits it, and here's Hanut, comes in behind, hits a long shot right out towards the centre of the game, met by Bob Ashton, who hits it clear of the gain again, and that is the finish of the game with Australia, the Goulburn team of Australia winning against the Jaguars of England by 9 goals to 7.